Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I'm your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 143, recording on Monday, January 26th, a day after the Seattle Seahawks beat the Los Angeles Rams and the Patriots won against the Denver Broncos. And so the Super Bowl will be the Seahawks and the Patriots. Going to talk a little bit about that. We'll go heavy on Sam Darnold and what it was like watching him in that game and how I've thought about it from a Vikings perspective. Going to hit some updates on the Vikings coaching staff and where some situations lie there. And then we'll end it with some draft conversation. The All-Star games are starting to ramp up. Shrine Game last week, Senior Bowl this week, some of my favorite events of the calendar. And I've started to dive a little bit into some of the prospects at positions that will be of need for the Vikings in this upcoming cycle. So looking forward to that for our conversation today. Before I get into those subjects, I did just want to start a little bit talking about Minneapolis. First, those who know me know I don't really talk about politics a lot. I'm a sports writer, and so I don't try to mask what my expertise is in life. That said, the circumstances here, in my opinion, are less about politics than they are about humanity and what is right versus wrong. And what's happened here over the last couple weeks has been wrong. It's been abhorrent, frankly, to watch some of it, especially in a place that, I moved here in 2022. I have loved everything about being here besides the weather that we are experiencing right now, being from Alabama. And the people have been phenomenal. That's all people I've met in person, people that I've met through the job that I do, people that I've met just being out and about. I cannot say enough how cool this place has been to get to be a part of, frankly. It's part of the reason why I started this podcast, was just to have more direct connection with genuine people who do all different things and come from all different walks of life in this place. And so that's something that I don't take for granted. I don't do this podcast as an escape for people. Like, if that is what it is for certain people, then that's great. But I'm also of the belief that a lot of things in life, like reality, shouldn't be escaped sometimes. And so that's kind of my perspective on that. This is a job for me. It's why I do it. It's why I write every day. That's not going to stop, because that is the job. But what I would say is, again, to see how things have played out over the last couple weeks, it has been jarring, to put it lightly. And I would say, on the other hand, to see how people in this community have banded together in support of what's right has been something that I think is part of what makes this place as special as it is. The last thing I'll say is, I was on the radio Friday on KFAN when there was a comment made by one of the other hosts. It was a horrendous comment. It's not something that I'm going to probably forget for a long time. And so yeah, that's what I will say on that subject. And yeah, you never want to, whether it's writing, radio, podcast, you don't want it to make it, you never want it, at least I never want it to be about me. I know there's an irony there with the fact that the show is literally under my name, but that is just one of the guiding principles of how I've gone about this job and will always go about it. Like, you do the job to be a reporter, to be objective, and to be factual, and to be empathetic, and be there for what's right. So that's kind of the principles that will always guide how I go about this thing, both the job and off mic or away from the byline, is what I would say. Anyway, hard segue, obviously, but the one that we're going to have to do to Sam Darnold and what he was able to do for the Seattle Seahawks on Sunday night against the Los Angeles Rams. I will first say that, boy, was that game a joy to watch. Those who know me also know that I love these games beyond belief. I have friends who joke with me that at some point I will probably turn into a pylon given the amount of football I have consumed, whether it is the actual games or film or what have you. And that is a good joke for them. And it probably raises broader questions about how I spend my time. But just a phenomenal game to watch. The level of coaching on both sides, the level of execution on both sides. I mean, there were freaking amount of times where I'm watching the Los Angeles Rams offensive line and them diffusing the Seattle Seahawks pass rush that I think is unbelievable, and was highly impressed by that. And then there were other instances where you're watching Devontae Adams win down the field against Devon Witherspoon and Jackson Jobe, who's really come on, and Tariq Woolen, etc. And it was just highly impressive. But obviously my mind was, and my eyes were trained on Sam Darnold to see how he would manage that environment, that stage, that level of opportunity. And I mean, he was spectacular. I went and watched the film this morning just to verify and look back at what I thought I was seeing in the moment. But I mean, it was pretty much everything that those you guys listening to this who have watched this show, but who have watched the Vikings games in years past and who watched Sam Darnold really closely in 2024. I mean, it was all of the goods of what we were able to see throughout that season, all of us. I mean, whether it was the mobility, whether it was the pocket movement, the ability to layer the football. I mean, Jackson Smith and Jigba got a ton of praise, and rightfully so, for the one-handed catch over the sideline, but that ball was dropped up and over a defender, and just in an incredible way. I mean, there was the 42-yard down the field throw over the middle to Jackson Smith and Jigba in a key moment before the end of the first half. That was another layered pass. There was anticipatory throws to the sideline. There was command at the line of scrimmage, and just a composure and a professionalism and poise with the way that he operated throughout that entire game. That was highly impressive. I mean, over the course of his previous games against the Rams, it has felt like he has gotten consumed, Sam has, with the pressure up front and the moving and shifting in disguise on the back end. But in this game, it felt like he almost blocked out a lot of the pressure up front. It was just reading the field the way he does with his feet and eyes that keep him on time and in rhythm, in a way that makes it look much easier than it probably is. I mean, I over the course of the game and then rewatching it this morning, like, I thought a lot about the conversations that I had at the end of the 2024 season before the final two games, but with people who know this stuff at a level that I never will, whether you're talking Nick Mullins, whether you're talking Brett Rippon, whether you're talking Josh McCown, whether you're talking Grant Udinski. I mean, I remember sitting down with a lot of these guys at the end of the 2024 season to talk to them about what they felt was most impressive with Sam. And you got responses of the toughness, the arm talent, the ability to manage this system that is very complex. I mean, all that stuff came up, but the thing that stood out most within those conversations, and I couldn't stop thinking about last night or this morning, was the comments that were like, what he's doing right now looks easy, and it is not at all easy. And like, I think that's something that, just pairing it with where the Vikings are at right now, I mean, I think it's, in some ways, you expect in a certain system a quarterback to reach a certain floor, but I think sometimes maybe that mitigates the amount of credit that should go to the quarterback for being able to execute at a certain floor, frankly. So, yeah, I was blown away by the performance. I mean, there were multiple instances where he's got a guy right in his face or right in his lap, and he is layering the ball out there in space and on time and with accuracy. There were other instances where he's progressing 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, getting all the way to the backside. I don't think you can overstate the importance of what that offensive line in Seattle was able to do for them in that game. That unit and what those coaches there have done with that offensive line should not go, in my opinion, at least from my perch, should not go overlooked or unnoticed at all. And what that Seahawks team has been able to do all year, like for as good as their trenches on the defensive side have been, offensively, that group, I think by all accounts, has just massively overachieved this entire year. And that's usually a testament to both the players and the coaches. And so I think that group's ability to hold up allows Sam to not have to be sped up mentally, which was something that we saw happen last year in those final 2 games. And then that group's ability to run block and what Kenneth Walker did for them on the run from the running perspective to make them right when those run blocks weren't perfect. Like all of that stuff really, really matters, I think, too, within the calculus of what Sam has been able to do and has done. Like I talked to someone in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and they said to me, like, when you run the football, it makes things so much easier. And that's not something that is new probably to anybody you guys who have probably watched football for much longer in your lives than I have, but it's something that is a consistent reminder throughout some of these games. I thought Clint Kubiak, the Seahawks offensive coordinator and play caller, was on a heater throughout the entire night. Whether it was screens dialed up at the perfect time, whether it was a commitment to the run game that continued, whether it was a faith throughout the second half in that game to know that if the Seahawks were going to keep up with the Rams, they were going to have to get in a drop back game, and Sam was going to have to make plays. And there was a trust level there. There was a commitment there. And Sam obviously made that really, really work. As far as what you guys are here for, which is the Vikings part of the conversation, I mean, I've spent a lot of hours today going back through all of the notes of the offseason and into the offseason regarding the decision to move on from Sam. I mean, you go back, my colleague at The Athletic, Diana Rossini, after the it was either the week 15, week 16 game, might have been the game in Seattle, the comeback that Sam Darnold charted in Seattle for the Vikings in 2024. You go back, and I remember she wrote a notebook that cited a source saying, we absolutely want Sam back for 2025. And then the games play out the way they do down the stretch. And I mean, frankly, I remember writing a very critical piece, and this is me being open, a very critical piece after that wild card game against the Rams of what decisions do the Vikings have to make at this point. But to go from we absolutely want him back to a couple weeks later, being willing to part with him, I'd say the Vikings obviously offered Sam Darnold a 1-year contract. Seattle ended up fully guaranteeing him $37.5 million, guaranteeing him $55 million. So there was that dynamic of it. But Kevin O'Connell said many times throughout the offseason, like, Sam Darnold has earned the right to become a free agent. Well, the team has the opportunity always to prevent that player from hitting free agency, whether it's a long-term extension, whether it was a franchise tag. The Vikings obviously didn't go down either of those paths, and they believed in the end, for an abundance of reasons, that it made sense to transition to J.J. McCarthy. One of those reasons was the fact that the Vikings really committed to J.J. McCarthy when they drafted him. Another one of the reasons was, if you don't turn it over to J.J. McCarthy, how is he going to handle it? How's the representation going to handle it? What is that going to mean for his long-term development? I mean, there were a lot of questions there, but I can convincingly tell you this too. Like, there were people internally that pushed for the Vikings to bring Sam back, believing that he would further progress in a second year in the system, and that he really fit the style of offense that the Vikings run, which is, and want to run, which is a downfield passing game that is often at its best with someone at the controls who can handle a lot at the line of scrimmage, and obviously for a game plan into a game. So there were people who pushed that. There was skepticism at the time about J.J. McCarthy's readiness. A couple weeks ago, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah in the press conference said that all of the information the Vikings had made them feel comfortable with that decision. But there's no doubt, just in conversation, that there were questions internally about the readiness, which is eventually why the Vikings tried to bring back Daniel Jones, and eventually why the Aaron Rodgers conversation that frustrated a lot of people obviously existed. And it was because the Vikings team knew that they needed serious insurance at the quarterback position. And I don't need to move forward of how the season played out, but early in the year, I mean, I remember talking to people internally, and this, I mean, it's people writ large, whether you're talking staff, executives, coaches, players who understood what the Seahawks were doing with Sam Darnold and understood the challenge that the Vikings were having with their own offense. And I mean, it was really crazy to look at the disparity between the two situations. In Seattle, you had an offense that was humming with a quarterback that was thriving in a situation where, through personnel usage and a commitment to the run game, the Seahawks were really dictating to the defense that they had to stop the run, which allowed for an explosive passing game. And then over the course of the season, defenses adapted. They didn't really care as much against Seattle about the run game, and so they played more for coverage. Sam struggled a little bit, but now they've found more balance with the run game that has allowed them to obviously reach the Super Bowl. And in Minnesota, you had an offense that, I mean, it was pretty much in all systems failure. Offensive line, again, to reiterate, played a major role in that, specifically the injuries to the offensive line. The run game wasn't incredible to start the season. This offense, which had a certain standard of the types of plays that they ran and passing concepts and areas of the field that they targeted and sequences of plays, a lot of that wasn't able to be accessed because you had a young quarterback, and then you had a quarterback in Carson Wentz who arrived really, really late before the season. So, I mean, it raises some really hard questions. I think there's some definitely, you guys might be wondering, so what's the moral of the story? What's the takeaway? I mean, I think it's probably going to be different for a lot of different people. I mean, there's the, the psychological, heuristic probably that talks about how the end of, whether it's a movie or a story or a sequence in life, like really sticks with you more intensely than the entire journey, like that, and how it ended for Sam in Minnesota. Like, you wonder if that was at play. I mean, I think there's lessons to be learned about, the risk that you're taking when you turn it over to a young quarterback. And I think there's lessons to be learned about, as much as a system can really help a quarterback, I really think, there's also a lot to be learned about how much a quarterback can really help a system and make a system look a certain way. So all of that stuff is probably the takeaway for me as I go through and as I went through and I've thought through the dynamics of watching Sam in that game, getting to a Super Bowl. I mean, it's and then you pair that with where the Vikings are at, and uncertainty at quarterback, back in the very familiar cycle. The options this offseason are, few and far between. And this Vikings regime is now entering their 5th season without a playoff win, with some really tough questions to answer. And it's a tough challenge. How can you advance the development of J.J. McCarthy while also ensuring you have a certain level of quarterback play where you can get to the playoff and win games? I mean, that to me feels like the attempt of trying to thread a very fine needle. And it's going to be fascinating, obviously, over the course of the next few weeks. A month away is the combine, so it'll be really interesting to see what's said there, and then beyond to see what decisions are made and who's brought in and how the Vikings try to round out the roster. I don't believe I've talked since Brian Flores reached terms with the Vikings to be back as the defensive coordinator, and probably should have done an emergency pod, but obviously a lot of circumstances at play, spending time elsewhere. But what I would say is, that is a massive thing for the Vikings to try to get back in postseason contention next year. I've talked a ton about Brian Flores over the course of having this podcast and covering this team and what he's done just for this defense. it's highly impressive. It's going to be really interesting to see what types of players they target, if they have and do indeed have needs on the defensive line or at safety or cornerback depth. But to bring back Brian Flores and have continuity there with a guy who knows the personnel, a guy who can evaluate personnel, a guy who knows this team and really well and the place and all of the facets of it. That was definitely a positive development for this team's attempt at reaching contention in the near future, given they haven't a lot in the recent past. So that's what I'd say about Brian Flores, and we'll segue a bit and get to some dynamics and some updates with the coaching staff. All right, we'll start with defensive line coach Marcus Dixon. If you go back to the story I wrote on the course of it was a macro story on the 2025 Viking season. And within that, there were a couple lines that I had about how, there are questions with Brian Flores, but there's also going to have to be a lot to sift through with the Viking staff. And I wrote that at the time knowing that there were many Viking staffers whose contracts were expiring at the conclusion of the 2025 season. One of those people whose contract was expiring was defensive line coach Marcus Dixon, who the Vikings hired a couple years ago from the Los Angeles Rams. He spent time with the Rams, spent time with the Broncos. Thought he did a really good job over the course of the last couple years, specifically when you talk about the development of Jalen Redmond and Levi Drake Rodriguez, those two guys. In particular, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins in his rookie season as a young player. Just thought he did a very admirable job. His contract expired, had a planned interview with the Dallas Cowboys, who hired Christian Parker to be their defensive coordinator recently. So, that's definitely a possibility for him from my understanding. And that would obviously leave the Vikings with another defensive line coach to hire. I mean, the Vikings have had multiple defensive line coaches in recent years. When you talk about a few years ago, it was Chris Rumpf, who left kind of on a whim. Believe he went to Clemson. There was an edge rusher coach, Mike Smith, who had a personal situation and stepped away. Now he's with the New England Patriots. Mike Pettin was in charge of that room 2 years ago, and then was kind of shifted, and that role then fell to Thad Bogertis, who had been with this staff for a long time. So a lot of shuffling with those groups, and it feels like there's going to have to be another one with the defensive line this upcoming spring. So it'll be interesting to see if Marcus Dixon does get that Cowboys job, and then what the Vikings do on the defensive line, which is, it's a massive position. There's a lot of decisions that are going to have to be made there. Javon Hargrave, does he become a roster cut? Jonathan Allen is much more difficult to cut, but what does that circumstance look like? And then Jalen Redmond has been an exclusive rights free agent. What do the Vikings do there? Just a lot of, I just say, uncertainty with that group. And so it's one worth eyeing. Durante Jones, the Vikings defensive pass game coordinator, defensive backs coach, has interviewed a ton throughout this cycle. From what I know, he really did a great job in the Dallas Cowboys interview, and was definitely a possible option there. They ultimately went with Christian Parker, who had been a defensive backs coach with the Philadelphia Eagles, and Christian is highly respected throughout the industry. But, Durante Jones' name has surfaced with almost every one of these openings, whether it's the Packers, the Giants, the Chargers, Miami, Washington. The Commanders still have not hired a defensive coordinator position. So, and it's my understanding that there's respect there, for Durante. So, if he were to depart for a defensive coordinator job, that would leave more questions in the secondary, obviously, when you're talking about the Vikings lost the safeties coach, Michael Hutchings, to Cal to become the defensive coordinator. What would that look like? Would there be shuffling on the defensive staff? And then how would they replace certain spots? I mean, this stuff really matters. Like, not to segue crazy, but I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with coaches in the industry and agents and executives over the last few weeks. And one of the things that comes up is, as much as gets made about who gets hired as the head coach or who gets hired as the coordinator, and not as much gets made about who the position coaches are, like, those hires are massive. And it is incumbent upon the people in those primary roles to have a level of respect, relationships, a level of evaluation to bring in the right people for the coaches who really have as much of a direct touch point with players and development of those players as possible. I've said it many times on this podcast in recent weeks and months, like, a lot of conversation happens with drafting, but the draft process is one aspect, and then there's the developmental process, and a lot of times that falls on the position coaches. And so these hires, whether it's people on the staff like a Marcus Dixon, Durante Jones, if they are to leave, that stuff really matters. And then who those guys get replaced with really matter as well. So with Durante, we'll see. I kind of entered this cycle thinking that there was a pretty high probability that he would eventually become a defensive coordinator. And that came from nothing other than talking to executives who were in interviews that Durante did last offseason and the amount of praise that he was given from those interviews. Like, I know Durante is respected from the type of guy that he is, the type of guy that he is to work with, the experiences that he's had being with Lou Anarumo, Mike Zimmer, Carl Scott, Brian Flores in college at LSU. Like, there is a lot of experience there, and Durante has seen a lot. And so just not going to be surprised if he gets one of these defensive coordinator positions. And then the last subject probably to discuss or talk about with the Vikings coaching staff is obviously the offensive line role that is open, given the Vikings did not retain Chris Cooper, the offensive line coach, whose contract expired. I've said this, I think, on last week's podcast. The Vikings were very quick in putting together a list of names and in engaging in interviews, knowing that it's a pretty competitive market right now. Some names who I have heard, Frank Smith, who was the OC in Miami with Mike McDaniel the past couple of seasons. We'll see if Frank follows Mike McDaniel to the Los Angeles Chargers, where he's worked before. Keith Carter, who has been the assistant with Chris Cooper, who was this past season, has, there's been a lot said from former players about Keith Carter, but it sounds like there was a respect level for how he worked inside the building this past season. Dwayne Ledford, the former Atlanta Falcons offensive line coach, was a name that I've heard, but my colleague at The Athletic, Jeff Zrebiec, has reported that he might be a possibility in Baltimore for the Ravens offensive line coach position. And then another name that I heard was Pat Meyer, who was most recently the Pittsburgh Steelers offensive line coach. Pat was in Carolina in 2020 and 2021 with a couple of the coaches on the Vikings staff, so there would be some familiarity there. But I'd say that's where the Vikings offensive line situation is. I stated when we did the emergency pod after Chris Cooper was the news surfaced that he wasn't going to be retained. Like, I think this is a massive hiring. I think it's very important. I think tangentially, it's only as important of a hire as the Vikings staff, and that obviously starts at the top, willingness to adapt, listen, think about balance on a deeper scale. So that's what I'd say with the offensive line coach position. But a lot, as I've stated in recent podcasts, the coaching stuff is very fluid. So certain domino here could affect dominoes there, and that's how that thing kind of goes. And then lastly, we want to talk about some draft stuff. I'm going to have some stories at The Athletic in the coming weeks, obviously, where I'm diving in more on priorities from a position perspective or evaluations from certain guys I've watched, mock drafts, that type of thing. We do it every spring. I love doing it. You start to hear more and talk to more people about certain prospects, and it becomes one of my favorite parts of doing the job, just because I track every year. Who did I watch? What did I think about them? How does that compare to draft analysts? How does that compare to teams? And then years later, getting to look back, what did I see? Nicky Manwari was a guy who, as a safety, I was like, does he see it well? Does he process well? How's that going to look down the field if he's having to play the deep half? Well, the Seahawks drafted him. It's been a phenomenal situation for him. He's fit really, really well. He's been an incredible, like a defense and paradigm shifting nickel for them in terms of what they've been able to do. So I'll run through a list of guys I've watched on tape recently, and it'll give you a feel for the positions that I've been looking at. I'm going to pull up my document here that I keep for myself, just watching the tape. So defensive line, I've watched some guys. Cornerback, I've watched some guys. Safety, I've watched some guys. A lot of different players. I'd say at defensive line, there was an intriguing defensive lineman, defensive tackle, pass rush type player, Skylar Gill-Howard from Texas Tech, who I found pretty interesting, pretty explosive player. Keldrick Falk, who will go pretty high in the draft. Kind of a tweener between like an edge rusher type body and defensive tackle type body, but really smart player. Looks like he deciphers things very well. So a guy I'm looking forward to watching more of. Cornerback, I love Mansour Delane, the LSU corner. Just think he's very sharp, can play off coverage, can play man coverage. I doubt he's going to be the most, light up the combine measurables, explosiveness scores, but like for me, he's just a guy. It's like, can you play? And that I do love those types of guys. Watch Chris Johnson from San Diego State. Interesting player. Maybe my favorite to watch on film of all the prospects I've watched so far has been D'Angelo Pons, the undersized Indiana corner. Just a joy to watch. Like the type of guy where you watch, and I love these dudes. Like for me, last year was Walter Nolan, one of the defensive tackles, where I just can't get enough of watching the film because of the plays he makes. So D'Angelo Pons from Indiana, Malik Muhammad, the corner from Texas. Some of the safeties, interesting safety class. The one that's probably stood out the most to me is Emmanuel McNeil-Lauren from Toledo. Just in terms of his ability to see it, his just him being unafraid of physicality, just the ability to make tackles kind of near the line of scrimmage and play deep. I just really like that guy in some of the brief film that I've seen. But there, a lot of names you see, whether it's AJ Halsey, LSU, Dylan Thieneman of Oregon, Kyle Lewis, kind of a versatile body from Pittsburgh that I think Brian Flores might like, even though I don't know if the tape was as good as maybe the vision for the player might be. So a lot of different guys, but those are some of the positions I've watched. The offensive line stuff, whether it's tackle, guard, I will dive into that. It takes, that you need a strong cup of coffee to dive into that film. And I will say, the film is not just some passive thing. To really evaluate it, you have to be pretty locked in as you're watching. So more of that stuff will come. And any questions you guys have or players you think you'd be curious about what I think of them, I am all ears for that. But we're going to do some guests in the coming weeks. Looking forward to those. I know I've teased that for a while, but have been lining some stuff up and wanted to take a little breather, obviously, just after the season to kind of rest, recoup, recharge a little bit to ensure that I am bringing my best on a week-to-week basis, both here and in print. Like I've said, I write for The Athletic and do that on a daily basis. Going to have a story about Sam Darnold for Tuesday that I put a lot of time in, so I highly recommend you guys check that out. Appreciate you guys being here, obviously, as always, and watching and listening, whether you're doing it through audio and video. But yeah, that'll do it for episode 143. We will talk to you guys very, very soon.